Now, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has angrily condemned the chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court for seeking arrest warrants for him and his defense minister Yoav Gallant, alongside the leaders of Hamas, over alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Gaza conflict. Mr. Netanyahu said he rejected with disgust that democratic Israel had been compared with what he called mass murderers. And the US President Joe Biden has said there is no equivalent between Israel and Hamas. But France has declined to criticize the International Criminal Court. The French Foreign Ministry said it supported the court and what it called its fight against impunity in all situations. Similarly, Germany's Foreign Ministry said it respects the independence and procedures of the ICC, though it criticized the simultaneous publication of the charges against Israeli and Hamas leaders, saying the move created the incorrect impression of equivalency. On Monday, the chief prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan, said there were reasonable grounds to believe that Mr. Netanyahu and the defense minister Yoav Gallant bore criminal responsibility for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza. So what impact is all this likely to have? Could, for instance, the request for arrest warrants jeopardize ongoing efforts to reach a ceasefire deal, as the US Secretary of State has suggested? Well, for his assessment, I'm joined now on the line by the Israeli ambassador to Nigeria, Michael Freeman. Mr. Freeman, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us. What's your reaction to the decision by the ICC prosecutor to seek arrest warrants against your Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant?
Good evening, Charles, and thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure. Look, this is an outrageous decision. It's an absolutely outrageous decision that makes a comparison between the democratically elected leaders of Israel and the murderers and rapists of Hamas. It also goes against the entire basis of the ICC and the entire basis of how it was set up. Israel, as I'm sure you know, is not a signatory to the Rome Statute, is not a state member of the ICC. We don't believe that the ICC has any jurisdiction whatsoever over this conflict and over Israel, and therefore to make this decision is outrageous and will end up probably doing more damage to the ICC and will certainly mean the chances of a ceasefire are pushed further and further away.
But, I mean, obviously, Ambassador Freeman, international law applies to all combatants, and the ICC is a recognized court internationally. I mean, you've got a British background. I mean, Britain is a signatory to the ICC. I mean, don't you think that the prosecutor is being even-handed by going after both Israeli officials and Hamas?
Absolutely not. There's no comparison whatsoever to a terrorist organization whose leaders are currently hiding in bunkers, who went into Israel and massacred over 1,000 innocent civilians, and a country that is acting in legitimate self-defense to ensure that that doesn't happen again. But it's even more worrying that, you know, you mentioned my background, but I would like to also mention Nigeria, where here in Nigeria, and 2 years ago, the same prosecutor was here in Nigeria and met with Nigeria's leadership. And he said, look, when it comes to the war between Nigeria and Boko Haram, we believe the case has been met in order to potentially move forward. But because Nigeria has an independent judicial system, the concept of complementarity holds. That is, that the ICC can't get involved because Nigeria has a court system to investigate itself. Well, it's quite clear that Israel also has an independent court system, one of the most respected independent court systems in the world, that is able and can look at and examine and try, if necessary, Israelis, including the leaders. Look, Prime Minister Netanyahu is currently undergoing a court trial at the moment over allegations of corruption, which shows that we have a totally independent court system. If the ICC is allowed at this point to say that we undermine our fundamental principle of complementarity, then every country in the world will be scared. You know, as I said to you, the reason that they claim they didn't open a case against Nigeria and bring Nigeria's leaders to the ICC is because they said they're a democracy with an independent court system. Well, so is Israel with an independent court system and a democracy. And once this is changed, and once you suddenly say that complementarity is no longer relevant and you'll go against it, then the entire basis of the ICC is taken apart. The ICC was founded as a court of last resort, where there was no other way to deal with anything. There was no other way, realistically, to bring these people to trial. Now, when it comes to Hamas and these terror leaders, who, by the way, are hiding in tunnels, and if we could find them, it would bring an end to the war in the first place. So I don't think we're going to be seeing them in The Hague anytime soon. So the reality is that this is out against democratically elected leaders. It's the first time that they've ever recommended against a democratically elected leader. And you can see the total farce and the total ridiculousness of this. Bashar al-Assad, who murdered hundreds and hundreds of thousands of his own people, has not been charged by the ICC. We've seen people in many, many other places, in Iran, the leaders of Iran who murdered their own people have not been charged by the ICC. And yet now they've decided that they want to request for Netanyahu and the leadership. It's outrageous, it's ridiculous, it has no base in law, and it will cause damage both to the peace process, the chance of a ceasefire, and I believe to the ICC itself.
Well, I mean, I think the point here, Ambassador, is that, I mean, you're making comparisons with Nigeria and other places. I mean, I think it's not about necessarily Israel. It is for the people of Gaza who have no recourse and no way of addressing some of the actions that have been carried out against them, both by Israel and by Hamas. I mean, it's not lost on Gazans that many of their family members, arguably in the thousands, would still be alive today had Hamas simply kept its fighters at home on October the 7th and not launched a horrendous, criminal, vile terror act against innocent Israeli civilians, which triggered this horrendous war. And there clearly needs to be accountability on the Hamas side. On the other hand, the massive actions by the Israeli military and the overt statements and clear anti-Palestinian sentiments that are harbored by senior Israeli officials have in turn influenced the war strategy of Israel, hasn't it? And as such, the people of Gaza deserve some measure of accountability, don't they?
But the reality is this: we're in the middle of fighting a war. If this were the case, then during the Second World War, the ICC would have put out against Winston Churchill as well. That in other cases around the world, they were put out against people who are defending their country. As you pointed out, Charles, this started on October the 7th, when Hamas, and by the way, Islamic Jihad, and I noticed there's no Islamic Jihad leader being mentioned there. They also carried out these horrendous attacks on the 7th of October. They massacred innocent civilians, they raped them, they murdered them, they burnt them alive, they tortured them, and they kidnapped over 200 of them. And then Israel responded, as any other country would, in order to ensure this didn't happen again, and to reach out and to take away the leadership and the ability of Hamas. If tomorrow morning or now the Hamas leadership were to say, we're done, we're finished, we surrender, this whole war would be finished. We would leave instantly. And, if you look at the analysis of the numbers of people killed and combatant to civilian ratio, they are some of, if not the lowest, of any conflict in the history of warfare, of urban warfare. The United Nations themselves say that in urban warfare, the expected combatant ratio is 9-1. 9 civilians for every terrorist who is killed. In this instance, even according to the United Nations figures, we are talking about 1-2 or 1-1. That is unprecedented in the history of urban warfare. It is so balanced against the Hamas and against the terrorists. And yet for that reason, Israel is having its leaders brought to the ICC. It's outrageous, and it's a terribly dangerous precedent that says that any democracy that is attacked cannot defend itself. And I can tell you now that I'm quite sure that all the radical terrorists around the world, all of the extremists, all of the murderers are saying to themselves, this is great for us. We can now attack anywhere we like, and no one can respond, because if anybody responds, the ICC is going to put out some spurious claim against them, and therefore we can do what we like, because ultimately we're not scared. We know we're never going to end up in the ICC anyway, because we hide in our bunkers and no one can ever find us. So this is really going to give great encouragement to all radical terrorists and extremists all around the world.
Well, I mean, let's be clear, Ambassador, that the arrest warrant is also being requested for Hamas leaders. It's not just Israel. And you must be aware that thousands of people in the Gaza Strip have lost their lives. That's an ineluctable fact. And there is simply no accountability. And the surviving relatives...
Well, in fairness, Charles, in every war, innocent civilians lose their life. I don't know of a single war in history where innocent civilians haven't lost their lives. In whether we talk about the Second World War, whether we talk about the war in Iraq, if we talk about the war in Afghanistan, if we even talk about war between the Nigerian government and Boko Haram and ISWAP, innocent civilians died. That is unfortunate. That's the price of war. I wish it wasn't true. I wish that there could be a war where the only people who died were the terrorists and the bad guys. But that isn't the reality in any war. Charles, I challenge you. Name me one war in history, one war where innocent civilians haven't died. And if we're going to say that the mark now for the ICC is that if an innocent civilian dies, we take the leaders to the court, well, then we're never, ever, ever going to be able to be in a place where you can respond to terror attacks, where countries can defend themselves, because leaders will always be at the risk of being brought to this ridiculous situation because all they're doing is defending their people. And if you want to understand, you mentioned about the Israeli government. Look at who's condemned this in Israel. This is across the board, from left to right. I've been condemning this as our agent. Even Prime Minister Netanyahu's biggest enemies in the government, the biggest enemies in the country in terms of these political enemies, have all said this is outrageous, it's disgusting, and it's not based on any fact or justice.
But, I mean, isn't it a fact, Ambassador, that there was political pressure from the more conservative parts of the Israeli government to increase the bank of targets in Gaza, and that led to a loosening of the rules of engagement and a loosening of the attributes that would cause a house or a neighborhood to be targeted by Israeli airstrikes or, artillery? What do you have to say, for example, to one, just out of many, one Palestinian survivor who's been all over the news and who had no Hamas members in his family and who was in Rafah when it was still designated a safe zone, and Israeli airstrikes targeted his family home, strikes that took place without warning. There were children as young as 3 months that were killed, shredded to pieces. I mean, what do you have to say to him?
I have to say to him that it's a tragedy, that I wish it wasn't happening, that I wish we weren't in this situation, that I'm genuinely sorry, and I wish it could end. And the way it can end is if Hamas lay down their arms and they release the hostages. As you well know, Charles, that at this moment, Hamas leaders and the Hamas terrorists aren't sitting in marked places. They're not in army bases. They don't have army bases. They operate in tunnels. They operate underneath schools, underneath hospitals, underneath civilian centers. That's how they are. We know that they're holding our hostages in tunnels, underneath civilian centers, underneath hospitals, inside schools. And we know that because we've interviewed the hostages that have been released, and we know where we've recovered the dead bodies of those that were murdered by Hamas inside Gaza, and they have been held inside civilian territory. And when Hamas hold these people inside civilian territories, they are effectively using the population as a civilian shield. And we therefore have to make a choice. And it's a horrific choice. Do we say that, okay, Hamas are totally immune? They've hidden inside civilian targets. They've hidden inside the mosques. They've hidden inside schools. They've hidden inside hospitals. Or do we say we're going to do what we need to do, doing everything we possibly can to avoid and minimize civilian casualties, but we cannot let these evil terrorists, these rapists, these murderers, these people who burnt people alive, who tortured people. We cannot allow them to do it again. And we will do what we need to do in order to track them down and to stop it happening. Because as you say, the people in Gaza have suffered because of Hamas. They're the ones who are suffering on a regular basis. And if you see the reports and you see the news channels where people are allowed to speak, they chant against Hamas. They say they call them dogs. They say they want them ended. They say they want to get rid of Hamas. And so, it's a really difficult situation that we're in. And unfortunately, innocents are dying. And the death of an innocent is an absolute tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy. But the fact is, this is a war. And in war, innocents die. And it's terrible. It's tragic. I wish it weren't the case. But that has always been the reality of war. And it's a horrific reality of war. But the people to blame for that are Hamas.
Ambassador, I want to thank you very much indeed. We're always grateful to you for taking the time to talk to us and explain the Israeli perspective in that awful conflict in Gaza. Michael Freeman is the Israeli ambassador to Nigeria, and he was talking to me on the line there. Thank you very much indeed. And that's it for this edition of Arise Prime Time. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.